Alger Hiss entered federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania on March 22, 1951, and served 44 months. That's time off for good behavior. Through this time and until the day he died, he continued calmly to claim innocence. And his first official attempt at vindication came in 1952 in a motion for a new trial on grounds of newly discovered evidence. And for what I'm about to say, both ideas and some phrases, I give some credit to Professor Irving Younger and much credit to Professor Herbert Packer of Stanford Law School. Hiss got a new lawyer, his A-team lawyers sort of exit stage right, got a new lawyer named Chester Lane. I've only heard him described as flamboyant. He was the former general counsel of the Securities and Exchange Commission, so he's obviously a very good lawyer. And Mr. Lane thought of the words Hiss uttered just before being sentenced, that Chambers had been able to commit forgery by typewriter. And Mr. Lane came to believe, correctly I think, that what had damaged Hiss most, the hole he could never dig himself out of, was his admission that the typed spy documents that Chambers produced had been typed on the Hiss Home Typewriter. And Mr. Lane came up with a conspiracy theory that will be mother's milk to those of you who like spooky conspiracy theories. Now I'm going to try and explain the ins and outs of forgery by typewriter as clearly as I can, but let me warn you, this gets very complicated. I'll try and be clear, but there's no way I can make it simple. Now Mr. Lane recalled that the evidence that had linked Hiss to the Hiss Home Typewriter to the spy documents was the opinion of the FBI expert, Mr. Feehan, that the Hiss standards and the spy documents had been typed on the same typewriter. And that Mr. Feehan's basis for that opinion was that he found 10 same peculiarities of type, nicks and scratches, in both sets of documents. And it was the accepted rule of the profession of document examiners that if 10 identical peculiarities of type occur in two typed documents or two sets of typed documents, you can be sure they were typed on the same typewriter. And Mr. Lane began to wonder if it might be possible to make a typewriter that had the same peculiarities of type as another typewriter. And he had a very hard time finding an expert who said that this could be done. He found a man named Martin Teitel, who had a big typewriter business in the financial district of Manhattan. And he said to him, "Mr. Teitel, if I gave you a typed document, could you look at it and tell me what kind of typewriter it was typed on?" And Teitel said, "Sure, any of us could do that." And then he said, "Okay, Mr. Teitel, could you then, if you saw, oh, this document was typed in let's say, a 1929 Woodstock office model, could you get one of those yourself?" And Teitel said, "Sure. In fact, I may already have one. All of us in this profession have big morgues at home. Our basements and attics are filled with old typewriters, and we got paper bags full of keys from kinds of typewriters." "Okay," said Mr. Lane. "Next, could you look at the document I gave you and notice 10 peculiarities of type in it?" And Teitel said, "Sure, easy." And then Lane said, "Here's the hard one. Could you then take those 10 peculiarities of type that you'd seen in the document I gave you and put them into your typewriter?" And Mr. Teitel apparently was not inhibited by false modesty, said, "Not only could I do that, but I could import into my typewriter every peculiarity of type that I found in the document you gave me." And Mr. Lane said, "So that, Mr. Teitel, if you did that, we could give my document and a document typed on your typewriter to an expert like the FBI guy Feehan, and this expert, operating in complete honesty, at the height of his professional skill, and applying the standard tests of the profession, would conclude that those two documents had been typed on the same typewriter when in fact they'd been typed on different ones." And Lane said yes. Pardon me, Teitel said yes, and Lane said, "You're hired. Do it." I should add at once that even if Mr. Teitel did that, he would have only demonstrated that it was possible to commit forgery by typewriter. I presume Mr. Lane would then have to prove that forgery by typewriter had occurred in this case. Well, to get this started, Mr. Lane had to give Mr. Teitel a document typed in a typewriter, and the only typewriter Lane had was 230099. So he typed up some documents on it and gave them to Mr. Tytell to work with. And these documents I will call the 230099 samples. So we now have a third set of documents. I told you this is going to get complicated. Mr. Lane gave Mr. Tytell the 230099 samples. Tytell never saw 230099 itself. Mr. Tytell turned out to have a Woodstock model, a Woodstock office model made in the same year as 230099 in his basement, and he set to work on altering its keys to match the peculiarities of type he noticed in the 230099 samples. He said that he got more than 500 typefaces and nearly 2,000 pieces of type from old Woodstock typewriters as far away as Detroit and Chicago, and he tried to put exactly the same dent in the G that there was in 230099 and all the other peculiarities I went into. He used, among other tools, a binocular comparison microscope, diamond-tipped chisels for making the dents, a triangular India stone for rubbing down the chisel marks, and a superfine dental buffing tool to finish the surfaces. He also noticed that documents typed on 230099 had the strange property of the letters getting closer to each other as the typing on a line went from left to right, and he realized that this was caused by the roller on the typewriter getting thicker as it went from left to right, and he made 30 different rollers before he finally had one that had the same effect as the roller in 230099. And to do this, he used another instrument called an Ames densimeter. He also enlisted the help of two other document experts, a Ms. McCarthy and a Ms. Ehrlich. And Ms. McCarthy helped him by looking at documents he was producing on his fake typewriter and saying, oh, you haven't got the dent in the G just right, but you've got the E down, so that's fine, but the G still needs some work. Tytell worked so hard on this that at one point he went blind. And more than a year after he started, he had to wind up because the time for filing the motion for a new trial was approaching. He had made a fake Woodstock office typewriter, but would documents typed on it fool an expert who looked also at documents typed on 230099? Well, Tytell typed some documents on his fake typewriter, thus creating a fourth set of documents, which I'll call Mr. Tytell's Fabulous Fakes. And he and Ms. McCarthy and Ms. Ehrlich took the 230099 samples and Mr. Tytell's Fabulous Fakes. Ms. Ehrlich was seeing them for the first time, and I guess they shuffled them together, and each of them said, can I see that these two sets of documents were typed on two different typewriters, and can I put them in two piles? Or do I see so many identical peculiarities of type that an unwarned expert would think they were all typed on the same typewriter? Well, each of them wrote a long affidavit that was filed with Mr. Lane's motion for a new trial on grounds of newly discovered evidence. And the affidavits, despite, of course, some differences, all said basically the same thing on the really crucial issue. Each expert said, I can tell the difference between the 230099 samples and Mr. Tytell's Fabulous Fakes. But I don't think that any other expert in the world could, unless that expert had been forewarned that forgery by typewriter might have occurred and had his or her eyes peeled looking for it. Well, this is unconvincing evidence. I mean, after heroic labors on the part of all involved, we're really back where we started. We have a theory that it might be possible to make a fake typewriter that would fool an expert, but we don't have a fooled expert. 3 experts working for more than a year had not succeeded in committing forgery by typewriter. But Mr. Lane was not through. He then asked Mrs. Ehrlich to compare the spy documents, the Hiss standards, and the 230099 samples, and to give her opinion about whether either of the first 2 sets of documents was typed not on the same typewriter, but on 230099. And Miss Ehrlich had the opinion that she could not be sure that the Hiss standards had been typed on 230099, but that she thought that the spy documents had been typed on 230099. And Mr. Lane thought, that's strange, because that means If the spy documents, but not the Hiss standards, were typed on 230099, that means that 230099 is not the Hiss Home Typewriter, but the spy documents were typed on it. It was found where the Hiss Home Typewriter should have been, in the night watchman's home. You know, somebody must have created that as a fake typewriter, typed up the incriminating documents against it that Chambers produced at the deposition, and then taken the real Hiss Home Typewriter away from the night watchman's basement and planted 230099 there. And he said, now I see what was going on. And he presented a new theory in his motion. He said 230099 is not the Hiss Home Typewriter. It's a fake. Chambers fabricated it in 1948, all by himself, or he had some communist friends help him, in a desperate attempt to defeat Hiss's libel suit. That Chambers used the fake he had made by typing up summaries of State Department papers that he'd gotten back in 1938 from his real spies in the State Department. And then Chambers found out that the real Hiss Home Typewriter was in the night watchman's home. He broke in there with his fake, which was 230099, planted the fake there, took away the real Hiss Home Typewriter, tossed it away, and then Chambers presented the fake documents at the deposition, knowing that eventually someone, the Hiss defense or the FBI, would come to where the Hiss Home Typewriter should be, the night watchman's house, would find 23009 there, and think it was the Hiss Home Typewriter, and then it would be found that the spy documents were typed on 230099, and Hiss goes to prison. And Mr. Lane argued on behalf of Hiss that this theory and the experts' affidavits showed that the FBI expert Feehan's testimony at the trial was absolutely worthless because it did not disprove the possibility of a forged typewriter. Well, Judge Goddard, who presided at the second trial, ruled on this motion, and he denied it. He found it to be built on what he called an erroneous elementary assumption that Feehan had only compared 10 peculiarities in both sets of documents, the Hiss standards and the spy documents. In fact, Mr. Feehan said in an affidavit that while my testimony at the trials concerned only 10 peculiarities, I'd actually examined each typewritten character, taking into consideration style of type, alignment, horizontal and vertical spacing, footing, variations, and defects. So in other words, to fool Mr. Feehan, anyone forging the spy documents would have had to make many more than 10 peculiarities of type appear in them, and Hiss's experts couldn't even accomplish 10. This destroyed the foundation on which Hiss's motion was built. And the whole, as to the whole theory of forgery by typewriter and Chambers making a fake and planting it in the night watchman's home, it came under devastating criticism by Judge Goddard and later Professor Packer and Smith College Professor Weinstein, who's the author of the definitive book on the case. There's about 10 problems with this theory. First, the first few are legal, but sometimes the law makes sense, so I'll go through them. Number one, in order to prevail on a motion for a new trial on grounds of newly discovered evidence, you need newly discovered evidence. And there's no newly discovered evidence here. The evidence is the typewriter, 230099, was in evidence in both trials. Mr. Lane has come up with a new theory of the Hiss defense, but a clever guy, but you don't get a new trial for coming up with a new theory. And Hiss had excellent counsel at both trials, obviously. And second, it has to be not only newly discovered evidence, evidence you didn't have at the trial, it has to be evidence that you couldn't have gotten at the trial. Like, I had an alibi witness I looked for and couldn't find him. It turned out he'd gone to Peru for 2 years and he just came back in town. You know, nobody knew he was there. I couldn't possibly have found him in time for the trial. Well, there's nothing in this theory that Hiss couldn't have advanced at his trials. He just chose not to make this argument. The third problem with the forgery by typewriter theory, and this, I'm going to get very picky here, even if 230099 is not the Hiss Home Typewriter, that does not undercut the prosecution's evidence. And I'm choosing my words very carefully there. The prosecution's evidence that linked the spy documents to the Hiss Home Typewriter, remember, was Mr. Feehan's comparison of two sets of documents, the Hiss standards and the spy documents. The typewriter itself was not part of the prosecution's evidence. Feehan said These two sets of documents were typed on the same typewriter. Period. End of testimony. Feehan did not say, and that typewriter was 2300099. It was Hiss who said that. Hiss brought 2300099 into the courtroom and authenticated it as Hiss Home Typewriter. Now, after he did that, the prosecution picked up on that, but it is also true to say that, as Professor Younger noted, the evidence that convicted Hiss would have been exactly the same if no typewriter had ever been found. This is a fact that is too often missed by people who say the typewriter was the crucial evidence in the case. That's just wrong. Now, this is somewhat picky because, in fairness, if 2300099 is not the Hiss Home Typewriter, that's rather disturbing because it was found where the Hiss Home Typewriter should be. And if you go where typewriter A should be and you find B, somebody's done a dirty deed in the dark. So let's go back and examine this theory, see whether it's plausible that Chambers, desperate for supporting evidence to defeat Hiss's suit, made a fake typewriter, typed up incriminating forgeries on it, and broke into the night watchman's home, planted the fake 2300099, stole the real one. Problem number 4, there's not a scintilla of evidence that that happened. 5, there's a problem of timing. Hiss sued Chambers in September, and Chambers, that's when, supposedly by this theory, Chambers began thinking of forgery by typewriter. Chambers produced the typewritten documents in November, 2 months later. It's not a very long time in which to commit forgery by typewriter, especially if you're, in the meantime, milking the cows, editing Time magazine, and talking to lawyers. Recall that Teitel and his 2 helpers worked for more than a year and couldn't do it. 6th, obviously, Chambers had none of the skills or the tools to do this. He had no communist friends in 1948. The only organization that even arguably had the skills and tools to make a fake typewriter in short order was the FBI. But one bigwig at the FBI said later that he didn't think the Bureau had that level of technical competence in the late 40s, and no evidence has emerged from tens of thousands of pages of FBI documents showing its participation in any such scheme. On the contrary, the FBI documents show that at the time that any fakery would have to have been accomplished, the FBI, far from cooperating with Chambers, was holding him at arm's length and viewing him with intense suspicion. Well, a conspiracy freak might say, maybe those documents are a false paper trail created by Hoover to cover up his help in forging a typewriter. But those documents, as I explained, I think in 2 videos, make J. Edgar Hoover look rather foolish. And from what I've heard of Mr. Hoover, he's not the kind of person who would make a fake document that makes him look foolish. It's also noteworthy, and I find this strange, that in the motion, Hiss did not claim the FBI had anything to do with this. He said Chambers did this all by himself. And I really wonder why Hiss would not accuse the FBI, but he didn't. Well, 7th, this theory assumes that Chambers, or whoever did the forgery, knew where the real Hiss typewriter was. That's where he knew how to go and do the switcheroo. Well, if you knew where the real Hiss typewriter was, wouldn't you type up your incriminating documents on it? Why would you type them up on the fake if you knew where you could lay your hands on the real one? In fact, if you knew where the real typewriter was, as this theory assumes, why would you even make a fake? It's got to be simpler to steal the real one for a day than to make a fake. 8th, how would Chambers find out that the Hiss Home Typewriter was in the night watchman's home? He would have to trace the chain of ownership link by link, and you may remember from the Hisses to the Catlett Kids to Bernetta Catlett and Dr. Easter and the Marlows and the night watchman. Every one of those people who was still alive in the late 1940s, and all but Dr. Easter was found and was interviewed, and not one of them ever said, then or ever after, that anyone came looking for the typewriter until after Chambers produced the typewritten documents at the deposition. In other words, until after any forgery would have to have occurred. And then consider the first link in that chain. How would Chambers find out that the Hisses had given the typewriter to the Catlett Kids? If we leave aside the guy in the brown jumpsuit with Woodstock repairman talking to Clyde Catlett, by far the most sensible way is that Hiss and Chambers are talking one day, and Chambers says, "Gee, Hilly, what happened to the typewriter used to be over there?" And Hiss says, "Oh, I gave it to the Catlett Kids. They live at 2728 P Street." And Chambers says, "Gotta go." Now consider the implications of such a conversation happening. That has to have happened after Hiss gave the typewriter away, which he said happened in late 1937, December 37. Let's assume that's true for the moment. For this conversation to have occurred, Hiss and Chambers have to be on friendly conversational terms in 1938, which is exactly the sort of friendship that Hiss denied from the very beginning. 10th and last, assume away all the problems I've just been mentioning. Your Chambers or the FBI or whoever, you're magically possessed of the time, tools, and talents with which to commit forgery by typewriter, and you do that, you type up your 64 incriminating forgeries on it. The typewriter's job is done. You don't want anyone to know you made a fake typewriter. What's the only sensible thing to do with your fake typewriter? You destroy it. You obliterate every trace it ever existed. And the last thing you do, the one thing you do not do, is plant it somewhere and hope it'll be found. That's crazy. Then you're running the risk it'll be found and will be examined as 230099 was and will be exposed as a fake. To paraphrase Professor Younger, anyone who's smart enough to make a fake typewriter would be smart enough to destroy it once its job was done. As Professor Packer said, the simple fact that 230099 existed in 1949 is strong evidence that it's not a fake. Well, Judge Goddard concluded that Hiss's theory was only a theory and a totally implausible one at that, and based on that theory alone, no jury would likely find Alger Hiss not guilty. He denied Hiss's motion for a new trial on grounds of newly discovered evidence. The Court of Appeals affirmed him without an opinion, a sign they thought that it was a no-brainer, and the Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. Personally, I think that had Mr. Lane's theory been presented to the second jury, they would have reacted the same way the grand jury reacted to Mr. Hiss's first explanation of the typed documents. They would have laughed. Next, what happened to Hiss, Chambers, and a few others after the trials? And this is a story of almost total sadness and suffering.